Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Tuesday everybody. We have a lot to cover today. It's a rather big video, so let's just dive in. Hidden local debt is a hot topic in China these days. While we've been following this closely for years now, these last few months, it has been receiving increasingly close attention from PRC academics, financial media, and leadership. To start today's video, we will look at this new coverage of this growing crisis from within China itself from this week. Chinese financial media outlet Caixin published a widely read cover story on this topic yesterday, Monday. The outlet's editors wrote that, quote, efforts to tackle the mountain of hidden debt accumulated by local governments has re-emerged as a priority on the agendas of top policymakers. End quote. Fresh concerns have mounted that weakening income growth and rising spending over the past few years may force local authorities to resort to new off-the-book borrowing while limiting their ability to pay down the debt. Quote, these liabilities are estimated by some to be almost $10 trillion, roughly double the GDP of Japan, the world's third largest economy. The urgency to ensure the sustainability of local finances has become more acute after the COVID-19 pandemic, which, along with a prolonged property crisis, have squeezed local coffers. End quote. Beijing is deeply concerned that any large-scale defaults, including by local government financing vehicles, could have a destabilizing impact on the banking sector and financial system, and as such, has ordered that provincial governments guard against risks of hidden debt. The problem, as regular viewers know too well, is that the growth and other directives placed on local governments often require debt-fueled spending, so less debt means slower growth. Thus, this acute policy challenge is systemic in nature. Quote, in recent years, policymakers and advisors have increasingly come to recognize, although it has been true for well over a decade, that the unrelenting surge in Chinese debt is the inevitable result of GDP growth targets that exceed the economy's underlying capacity. End quote. Much of the so-called hidden debt is held by local government financing vehicles, which the market sees as good as government debt, as well as public-private partnership projects, shady loan contracts, and other channels used by local governments to raise money. So far, no local government financing vehicle has failed to repay a bond, although there have been defaults on non-standard debt. The main holders of local government financing vehicle bonds include insurance companies and banks, who are also major lenders to the vehicles themselves. Thus, attempts to shave the debt down presents a Peter to Paul problem. As we've discussed in previous videos, while there is no publicly available official data on the current scale of hidden debt, it's estimated by Chinese sources to be around 70 trillion yuan, with the local government financing vehicle component expected to surge to over 100 trillion yuan within 5 years. According to the IMF, China Chengxin International Credit Ratings Co. believes that hidden debt is about 1.5 to 1.7 times the amount of on-the-book official debt. Goldman Sachs Group Inc. estimates that China's total government debt, including the hidden borrowing of thousands of financing companies across the country, is about $23 trillion. So when commentators talk about a mountain of debt, they are not exaggerating. The hope had been that after reopening this year, a surge in economic activity would give local governments wiggle room to start restructuring and paying down debt. Indeed, according to recent data from the Ministry of Finance, the general public balance revenue, which makes up most of the country's fiscal revenue, reached 2 trillion RMB, about $300 billion in April, approaching pre-pandemic levels. However, this is simply not enough. Quote, although governments' fiscal incomes have started to see a revival this year as the economy has reopened, the pace has been moderate, rising just 4% in the first 4 months. Meanwhile, land sales, the main revenue source for local governments, have continued to slide. Pessimism on the outlook for government finances this year is rife. There are less resources for authorities to tap to prevent immediate debt risks, and the task will become increasingly challenging, according to a local debt expert. End quote. Outside of China, international voices are concerned too. In an article this week called "China's $23 trillion local debt mess is about to get worse," US financial media outlet Bloomberg writes, quote, "While the chance of a municipal default in China is relatively low given Beijing's implicit guarantee on the debt, the bigger worry is that local governments will have to make painful spending cuts or divert money away from growth-boosting projects to continue repaying their debt." End quote. Others share similar concerns. Quote, "The central government may be able to keep things stable in the short term by asking banks to roll over local government's debt. The reality is that, without central government intervention, over 2/3 of the localities won't be able to repay their debt on time." End quote. And, quote, "The local government debt problem is spread throughout the country. While rich coastal areas will have more opportunities to repay their debt and more resources to draw on, less developed places are going to be much more limited in what they can do." End quote. It is very clear that Beijing has a debt crisis on its hands, and how and if it overcomes it will be one of the key stories for us to follow. Even if a financial crisis is averted, some commentators believe that this debt, along with the wider systemic issues from fiscal structuring to housing, is what will finally end China's age of high economic growth. Quote, "Frenzied attempts in recent years to bring debt under control simply cannot work until the country gives up on GDP growth targeting. These targets require local government borrowing to fund economic activity, but they cannot make this activity productive." But while a growing number of economic policy advisors are starting to recognize that China cannot get debt under control until it is willing to accept lower and more balanced growth rates, I think it may still require a few years before this is more widely accepted. End quote. Next up, US-China relations. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. It's just me making these episodes every day. It's a lot of work, but your guys' support is a huge source of motivation. Subscribing and sharing is a huge help as well, and for those who can go the extra mile and help me keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. At a press conference at the conclusion of the G7, which we saw produce the most critical statement on China to date, US President Joe Biden gave a speech on US-China relations. Though he expressed that he expects the two countries to see a thawing in relations very soon, his comments generally were full of mixed signals to both Beijing as well as Washington. On the one hand, he said that the US was considering dropping some sanctions on China, which a White House spokesperson soon after walked back, and called the surveillance balloon, quote, "a silly balloon," end quote. On the other hand, he once again called Taiwan a country, which his team also later walked back, and that export controls and sanctions are not a hostile act, but a legitimate tool that the US will stand by. The mixed signals may be a symptom of an administration divided on what its China policy should be. It also appears that his administration believes that Beijing itself is seeing a similar division in what its America policy should be. Quote, "Mr. Biden's own aides see a struggle underway in China between factions that want to restart the economic relationship with the United States and a far more powerful group that allies with President Xi Jinping's emphasis on national security over economic growth." End quote. In the remarks, President Biden also expressed, quote, "We're not looking to decouple from China, we're looking to de-risk and diversify our relationship with China." End quote. And, quote, "We're going to continue to put Taiwan in a position that they can defend themselves. And there is clear understanding among most of our allies that, in fact, if China were to act unilaterally, there would be a response. There would be a response." End quote. Okay, how has Beijing responded to this? Well, in response to Biden's words that he sees an imminent thawing in ties, a PRC Foreign Ministry spokesperson expressed on Monday, quote, The US says that it wants to speak to the Chinese side while seeking to suppress China through all possible means and impose sanctions on Chinese officials, institutions and companies. Is there any sincerity in and significance of any communication like this? End quote. State media coverage from Monday also does not appear to suggest that Beijing is anticipating any thawing in relations anytime soon, with state-run Xinhua in a commentary writing, quote, Uncle Sam found it more difficult than ever to hide its Pinocchio's nose when it attempted to manipulate its G7 allies into fabricating a list of provisions under the pretext of de-risking from China. The United States, a blatant bully long recognized as a major culprit of multiple global risks and threats, while making high-sounding claims about promoting a peaceful, stable and prosperous world, is virtually ripping the world apart and threatening other countries' economic growth by wielding its sword of coercive diplomacy. This, of course, is an old trick repeatedly played by the war-mongering nation. End quote. Again, this does not sound like a Beijing anticipating a thawing in relations, rather one still deeply committed to waging a narrative war with the US-led Anglophone world. Meanwhile, on Sunday, China's Cybersecurity Review Office announced that its cybersecurity review of US-based Micron Technologies products sold in China has, quote, found serious potential cybersecurity issues posing significant security risks to the supply chain of our country's critical information infrastructure and affecting our national security. Therefore, operators of critical information infrastructure within our country should stop purchasing Micron technology products. End quote. Thus, the large American producer of computer memory and computer data storage, including dynamic random access memory, flash memory, and USB flash drives, has been banned in China. Cutting off the firm is an interesting move, as it also hurts China to some degree. Begging the question, does Beijing believe that there really are national security risks at play, or is this purely a political move in response to US sanctions? Another question being asked is, will South Korean players now fill the gap? Samsung and Hynix compete directly with Micron in full-line memory products. However, we remember that Washington, which has leverage over its ally, has already warned Seoul not to take this market share from Micron in the event of a Chinese ban. On Monday, South Korea's Vice Minister of Trade told reporters, however, quote, regarding what the US tells us to do or not to do, it is actually up to our companies. Both Samsung and SK Hynix, with global operations, will make a judgment on this themselves. End quote. On Monday, a US Commerce Department spokesperson said the action against Micron, quote, along with the recent raids and targeting of other American firms, is inconsistent with the People's Republic of China's assertions that it is opening its markets and committed to a transparent regulatory framework. End quote. Thus, it is painfully obvious that US-China competition is heating up across many fronts. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a wonderful Tuesday wherever you are, and I will see you all tomorrow.